Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to be learning about conditional statements. Now, in the previous few videos, we learned about the history of Python, we set up environments, and in the last lesson, I gave you a nice lesson on data types. So that was like one step of getting closer to learning the basic fundamentals of Python programming. Well, today we're going to get one step closer with that by learning conditional statements. And I just want to point out that if anything doesn't make sense, you can always email us at gencode.us@gmail.com for any questions, comments, or concerns. So without further ado, let's just get into this presentation on conditional statements in Python programming. So what are conditional statements? The big question, what are conditional statements? Well, conditional statements are statements in programming that tell the interpreter if the condition is met, do this. Otherwise, if the condition is not met, do this instead. So in Python, we use the following words in conditional blocks. We use the if, the elif, and the else. So right now, it doesn't make sense what any of this means, but as we get closer to the end of the presentation, it'll all wrap up. And plus, I'll give you a little demo at the end on PyCharm on how this actually executes in a real interpreter. So let's look at an example of conditionals. So let's put programming to a side for a sec and just give you a little basic example of how a condition works. So let's say I want to go outside. I want to take a walk. But what clothes I wear, what I bring to that walk, all depends on how the weather is. So here I have an example right here on this presentation. So if it's raining outside, then I won't need to bring an umbrella. That's the if statement, right? The if, right? If it's raining outside, I still want to go for a walk even though it's raining. What I have to bring is an umbrella, right? That's the condition. If it's raining, I must bring an umbrella. Otherwise, I'll get wet, obviously. But if it's not raining, I do not have to bring an umbrella, right? So if it's sunny or not even raining at all in general, I do not have to bring an umbrella. That is the else statement. So this is where it comes together. If it's raining outside, I must bring an umbrella, otherwise I'll get wet. But if it's not raining outside, then I could go without an umbrella and still go for my walk. So that's a pretty basic example of a basic conditional statement from programming, but that was just a really basic example, and in programming it works just the same way when we put this into the interpreter. So let's go into the next slide. So here's a good conditional statement syntax, right? Here's the syntax. If, like I said in the previous example with the rain, I have to bring an umbrella. If it doesn't rain, I don't have to bring an umbrella. So this is what it's basically how you write in Python. If the condition, right, here's the condition. So let's say I replace this condition with if it's raining outside, do this, right? So I'm going to say bring an umbrella. This is the if statement, like I showed in the previous slide. But if it's not raining, else, I don't have to bring an umbrella. So I do the opposite or the alternative, basically. So this is a basic syntax on how a condition works in Python. And again, this will all make sense towards the end of the presentation. Plus, I'm going to give you a little demo so it'll all be clear. So don't worry, it'll take a little time to digest, but we'll get through it. So how does the if, elif, else statement work in Python, right? So every conditional block begins using the keyword if. So every time you start a if else statement or a conditional block, you must start with the if statement, right? If do this, if this happens, do this, else do something else, right? So this tells the interpreter if this condition happens, return this. So that's why we start with the if statement. But then we use the elif we use the elif. Now elif we only use if we have 3 or more conditions, right? So if we have more than 3 conditions, we will use the elif because we want, if this doesn't happen, then we do this. Otherwise, we just go by default to the else. And else is always, Python will automatically execute the else block if the if statement doesn't happen or the elif statement doesn't happen. it'll automatically do the else statement. Because if this doesn't happen, then this has to happen by default. So that's how the if else statement works, and there will be a little flowchart that could explain it more clearly as well, if it still didn't make sense. So again, like I said, here's a really important note in conditionals. You could have as many elif branches as you want. Like I said, if you have more than 3 conditions, you could keep putting more elif statements. So if it's raining, I have to bring a rain jacket, elif. If it's snowing, I have to bring a winter jacket, elif. If it's cloudy and cold, I have to bring a sweater, else I do something else. So that's how you use the elif. So you can use multiple elif. You can use like 10 elifs, and it's still fine in an if-else statement or in a conditional. But this pretty much replaces the select and switch command in other programming languages where you use in Java or C++. The elif basically replaces that in Python. So here's an example of a conditional block in Python, right? I wrote a nice basic example. So if 1 plus 1 equals 3, and remember, when we say equals, we use the 2 equal signs when we want to say something is equal to something. So 1 plus 1 equal to 3, right? Return happy. Elif, if 1 plus 1 is equal to 2, then we return cool, else return okay. So let's go through it a little bit, deep into it a little bit. So 1 plus 1 equals 3. Well, we know 1 plus 1 does not equal 3, right? It doesn't equal 3, so this cannot return happy. So we cannot, this doesn't execute, so if this doesn't meet, then we move on to the next one. Elif, 1 plus 1 equal 2. So do the math, 1 plus 1 does equal 2, right? So this statement is true. So therefore, we will execute this and we'll return this cool, and we don't have to execute the else. We just come out of the conditional block and we return the output, and that will be the output of cool. But remember, if this 1 plus 1 was equal to, let's say equal 4, right? Well, that's false, right? Just like 1 plus 1 equal 3, that's false. So this doesn't happen. And if this was 4 instead of 2, this wouldn't happen. So then, by default, we will have to go use the else statement, and it will just return okay. So if this doesn't happen, then this will return. If one of these conditions are met, then we automatically don't execute the rest. We just break out of the conditional block and we return the output. And that's how this flowchart works, right? See, we follow the flowchart. If this condition is true, we go more into it. If it's false, we move into the else statement. If the elif is true, we keep going. If it's not true, we keep going to the else. By default, it will always end up to the else statement. So not every if-else statement needs to have an else statement, but if you want to express 2 or more conditionals, you must have an if-else. And if it's 3 or more, obviously you need the elif statement as well. Okay, here's another thing I'd like to discuss in this lesson. Nested if statements. Now, what do I mean by nested if statements? So a nested if statement is when you, so in a nested if construct, you could have an if elif else construct inside another if elif else construct. And here's a little example of how this will work. So every statement, again, begins with if, right? So if expression 1 and then some condition, right? We put some statement here. If expression 1 do this condition, right? But now I have if this executes, right? I have to execute this too. Now I have to go into the next if statement right here. If expression 2 do this, right? And then I follow the pattern if. So if this doesn't happen, then I move on to the elif. If this doesn't happen, then I move on to the next elif. If this doesn't happen, automatically go by the else. And important, if this if statement does not execute at all, right? If this is false, I don't do any of this, right? I don't do any of this. If the if statement is false right here, then I don't have to execute anything inside this block. I just automatically just jump right into this else statement and execute whatever's down there. So again, I'm going to show you at the end in PyCharm how this actually works, so it will be more sense and make it more clear as well. But here's a nice little example right here I have on this slide. So here's a program, right? I named the test.py. So num, right? Num is equal to 5. So if the num is greater than 0, right? So the num is equal to 5. So num is greater. 5 is greater than 0, right? So then we'll print number is positive, right? So this is true. But now we have to go into the next if statement because we're inside. Remember, in Python, this is indentation. So if it's indented inside within another if, this will be nested. If it was out here, then these would be independent from each other. This won't affect this, but since they're nested, this thing will also affect, both of these are going to affect each other because these are dependent statements. So if the num is less than 10 now, print number is less than 10. So right now number is less than 10. So basically at the end of this, this will print out number is positive, right? Because it's greater than 0, but it's also less than 10. So I'll also print out this as well. So in the console, it'll actually print out number is positive, number is less than 10. It'll print out both of these statements because these are dependent on each other. Okay, so let's do a little recap here. So here are the key takeaways from today's Python Gencode lesson, right? Conditional statements are statements that tell the interpreter if this condition is met, return this output, else if it's not met, return this output instead. Pretty straightforward, right? And again, like a flowchart, conditional statements in computer science work exactly how a flowchart works, right? You just go through a path. If this path is false, you keep going. Move on to this one. If this path is false, then you move on to the next one. If it's true, you keep going. So it's basically like a flowchart. Conditional statements in computer science act like flowcharts. And the last thing, nested if statements are always dependent on each other, right? So if they're within each other, the indentations like this, these are dependent statements. But if this if statement was a little bit out here, lined up with this if statement, this would be independent. These two will be independent. But since they're within each other, this will affect this all the time because they're within each other. They're nested. That's what we call in computer science, nested if statements. But again, I'm gonna go give a little example of this stuff and a little demo in PyCharm. So since we're done with the presentation, let me just jump right into PyCharm and I'll show you a little demonstration of how this actually works live. So here's my IDE, right? Like every time we start Python, we always name it. So I named this test.py. So let's do a conditional, right? So again, if, right? Let's say if 1 plus 1 is equal to 3, then let me write print. And remember, print is a function in Python, so we want to print this into the console, so we type in print. So print happy. Right? But elif actually, so let's do this. If 1 plus 1 is equal to 3, print happy. Elif 1 plus 1 is equal to 2, print cool. And then obviously and let's just by default put an else statement. Here you could just say, you don't have to write a condition, you just have to say else, because there's no, these two condition methods will automatically have to execute that. Okay. So this is what we got. If I run this, I will get cool, right? Like I said, this is what will print, right? So let's look at it again, right? So if 1 plus 1 is equal to 3, right? Which is not, right? Because 1 plus 1 does not equal 3. If we do simple math, it doesn't equal 3. So this won't execute. So then we go to the elif, right? If 1 plus 1 is equal to 2, then print cool. And by default, right, we know 1 plus 1 does equal 2. So this is true. So automatically this will print cool. And then we don't have to execute the else. Since this came out true, we do not execute the rest. We break out and it'll print to the console, which it did. It printed out cool because 1 plus 1 is equal to 2. So we printed cool. So this is false. This is true. So this is going to print out. We do not execute the else. But if this was 4, now this will print out the else statement because this is false now too. So let's run it again. Now it's going to print out okay. And there we go. Okay. Because the 1 plus 1 does not equal to 3, right? So this won't happen. So it won't print happy. So this is not going to execute. So now we go to the elif. 1 plus 1 is equal to 4. Well, it's not equal to 4, right? It's equal to 2. So this is false now, right? So now it's not going to print cool. So now by default, we have to print the else statement, which is print okay. And that's what we got in the console. Okay. So this is a pretty straightforward lesson. It was pretty simple, pretty easy, right? This is going to get you one step closer to doing that capstone project. And using conditionals will help you make that whatever rock, paper, scissors, shoot game I showed you in the previous video. This is what's gonna, and this is gonna help you when you make something, when you use conditionals. This is when you're gonna have to use that. So this is like one step closer to that capstone project. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's lesson. Like I said, if you had any comments, questions, or concerns, please always email us, right, at jancode.us@gmail.com. And we'll get your questions answered as quick as possible. So, without further ado, I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you in the next lesson. Have a good day.